What's up, kings and queens? It's your boy Dan from Daft Previews, and I'm here once again to give you the most comprehensive NBA player prop preview you are going to see today for this upcoming slate. Now, I finished on a lot of picks yesterday. Unfortunately, it wasn't a winning day, but stay tuned for the interlude, and I'll talk you through what I learned and what strategy is going to be different for this upcoming set. But if you're new to this, what I do is I share my screen, I take you through an outlier, I go through all the key players and their matchups, talk about their form, I'll tell you what I like, I'll tell you what I don't, and I do all this to give you all the information that you need to make the best bets possible. Now, if that sounds interesting, let's go. So we're kicking things off with the Cleveland Cavaliers versus the Indiana Pacers. Now for Cleveland, Evan Mobley's still out. Donovan Mitchell is out for this one. Dean Wade is a game time decision for the Indiana Pacers. No major changes to their lineup either. So let's get through this and let's cat this game up. The Pacers are 7-point favorites in this game, by the way. So we'll kick things off with the Cavaliers first, starting with Darius Garland. Now, his points prop, 22.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10. The matchup's not too bad, but Garland's only covered this line in 1 of 5 games against the Indiana Pacers. If you want to look at his 3-point prop, the line's at 3.5. It's plus money, 5 out of his last 10, and only 1 out of his last 5. Jumping into his assist prop, line's at 6.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. Does have a difficult matchup here against Indiana, and he's gone under in 3 consecutive games, covering 2 of his last 5. Hopping into Jared Allen. Now his points prop here is at 17.5. Difficult matchup here against the Pacers. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games. Against the Pacers, he's gone under in 2 straight, covering in 2 out of his last 5. His rebound prop, 11.5. 2 out of his last 5 against the Pacers, and he's covered this in 4 out of his last 10, going under in 4 consecutive games. Now, if you don't have outlier, I'll do this one for you, but I'm not going to do it for every single player that's on this slate. But most importantly, you want to look at how he's performed without Donovan Mitchell and Evan Mobley. So if you're looking at his rebounds, he's had 8 games without Mobley and Mitchell. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 8. 4 very massive games, but has had a difficult time against Brooklyn and Phoenix going under. Matchup here is difficult against the Pacers, so I'd honestly lean to the under 11.5 in this one. But if we look at his points prop and we apply the same filters, let me just do that for you. D. Mitch, Evan Mobley, we can see that he's covered this in 4 out of those 8 games as well. So the 4 games he went over in rebounds are the 4 games he went over in points. So given he's got a difficult matchup for both, I'd probably look at the under in his points plus rebounds, 29.5. He has gone under in 3 out of his last 10 and obviously 4 out of the 8. But basically, if there's going to be a lot of people assuming, Mobley's not playing, Mitchell's not playing, Jared Allen's going to have a massive game, he may not, is what I'm saying right now. So I'm taking a short list of all the different plays to look into, but when I get to the interlude, I'll tell you about the change in my strategy. So let's have a look at Tyrese Halliburton now. His points prop, 18.5. He's covered this in 3 out of his last 10. Does have a tough matchup here against Cleveland. He's covered this in 2 out of his last 5 games against them. If you like his assists, that line's at 10.5. It's a lot lower than what his season average is, and that's because the matchup is somewhat difficult. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10, but he's made it rain against the Cavaliers, covering his assist prop in 4 out of his last 5 games. Having a look at Miles Turner now. I've also scrolled out. I did read a lot of comments. Well, there was one comment really, but got a few likes on it. You want to see the dates of what all the games happened, so I've zoomed out a little bit, increased the size of my head and my face so you can see more of that. And I know that's not what you want to see, but I'm a little bit of a narcissist, so there you go. But looking at Miles Turner here, his points props at 16.5. He's covered this in 3 out of his last 10 games, and he's got a difficult matchup here against Cleveland. Despite the difficult matchup, he's covered in 3 consecutive games against the Cavs, 3 out of his last 5. Looking at his rebound prop, 7.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. He's got a pretty good matchup here against the Cavs, and he's rebound extremely well, covering in 5 consecutive games against them. We're jumping into Spicy P, Pascal Siakam. Now, he's covered this line in 4 out of his last 10 games. He's yet to verse the Cavs since joining the Pacers. So 4 out of his last 10, but he does have a difficult matchup. His assist props at 3.5. It's plus money, 5 out of his last 10. And his rebound prop, 7.5. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games. So he's rebounding quite well. The matchup, somewhat difficult though. But I'll leave that up to you to decide. And they're all the key players in this game. So let's jump into the next one. It's the Miami Heat versus the Philadelphia 76ers. Now in this game, Jimmy Butler, Nikola Jovic, and Kevin Love Tobias Harris or game time decision. So we do have limited markets available at the moment, but we'll go through all the key players here and then we'll jump straight into the next one. So we're starting with Tyrese Maxey. So Tyrese Maxey's points prop is at 26.5. Somewhat difficult matchup here against Miami. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. Looking at head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 2 out of his last 4. His 3-point market, 3.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games and 2 out of his last 4 against the Miami Heat. Turning to his assists, his line's at 5.5. He's only covered in 2 out of his last 10 and 2 out of his last 4 against the Miami Heat. So his assist number's definitely down, and they're noticeably down since Kyle Lowry joined up. Kyle Lowry starting at point guard these days. Kyle Lowry doing the majority of the creating on offense. So Tyrese Maxey assist numbers taken a bit of a dip. If you want to look at his rebound prop, that's at 3.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10 and 2 of his last 4 against Miami. So nothing major going down there unless you do like the under in the assists, but under 5.5, that doesn't interest me. Let's have a look at Jimmy Butler. Now, Jimmy's points line's at 21.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. Against the 76ers, he's covered in 2 out of his last 3. His assist props at 5.5. It's plus money. 5 out of his last 10. And he's covered in 2 out of his last 3 against Philly. And his rebound prop, that's at 5.5 as well. 4 out of his last 10 games and only 1 out of his last 3 against the 76ers. So I'd honestly lean to the under in Jimmy's PRA. He's been a little bit, he's disappointing, especially if you've been betting on him. He has been disappointing. Looking at his PRA, he's really struggled over his last 3. And if you look at his head-to-heads, he's gone under in the last 2. So I'd lean to the under, but not something that I'm willing to bet on. Tobias Harris, his points prop 16.5 in this one. 4 out of his last 10 games. And against Miami, he's covered in 2 out of his last 4, scoring 27 points the last time he faced them. And looking at his assists now, line's at 2.5, 5 out of his last 10, 2 out of his last 4 against them. And his rebound prop, that's at 6.5 as well. 5 out of his last 10 games. And he's gone over in 1 out of his last 4 against Miami. So Tobias Harris, healthy or not, I will never bet on this man unless we find a good spot for his unders. The next one's Bam Adebayo. Hit a massive game winner today against the Detroit Pistons. His point sign's at 20.5. He's covered this in 3 out of his last 10 games. He's got a pretty good matchup here. No Joel Embiid. In head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 2 out of his last 5, but they have been his last 2 consecutive games. Having a look at his assists real quick, that line's at 3.5. Only 2 of his last 10 and 2 out of his last 5 against Philly, but his last 2 games against them were great. And if we look at his rebound prop, we're seeing lines of 10.5. He's covered this in 3 out of his last 4 games, but 3 out of his last 10. And in head-to-head matchups, his last 2 games against Philly, he's been a monster on the board. So his last 2 games against Philly, he's really covered every single line, points, rebounds, and his assist line. So if you put any stock in that, his 2 games against him this year, he's been an absolute monster. But looking at his last 10, he's only covered his PRA once, and that was that last game against Detroit. So I'd lean to the over, but it's not very convincing, to be honest. Jumping into the Detroit Pistons versus the Boston Celtics. So very similar to the other game, limited markets at the moment. So Asar Thompson is a game time decision, as well as Quentin Grimes for the Pistons. And Derek White, Jaylen Brown, Kristaps Porzingis, and Sam Hauser, all game time decisions for the Boston Celtics. So not many lines available at the moment. You've just got the 4 players from Detroit, so we'll get through them. We'll start with Cade Cunningham. We bet he's over in his assist prop most recently against Miami, which cashed. But looking at his points prop here, he's covered in 6 out of his last 10. He's gone under in 3 straight. He does have a good matchup here against Boston. He did score 31 points the last time he played them, covering in 1 out of his last 2. Looking at his assist prop, that's at 7.5. It's still plus money as it was today. The matchup, it's not too difficult, but it's not an easy one. He has covered this in 7 out of his last 10, and he had 9 assists against the Boston Celtics the last time they played. The way that I would personally look at it is probably an over in his points plus assists, because he's done well on both of those in the past against Boston. He had 40 points plus assists the last time they played. Noah Asar Thompson, I don't think that impacts Cade Cunningham's assist numbers at all or his points. So he should still get great opportunity. He only played 32 minutes today against the Miami Heat. So yes, he's on a back-to-back, but he's young. He'll be okay. Boston Celtics could be missing a few key pieces, The line is Boston minus 16 though, so there's a large blowout potential in this one. So yeah, I'd be a little bit hesitant, but points plus assists probably the best take on Cade Cunningham. Who else is there to look at? Beef Stew. We'll check his points and his boards. His points line's at 10.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. The matchup against Boston is difficult. He did score 14 points the last time he played them, covering in 2 out of his last 4. His rebound prop is at 6.5. He's covered this in 3 out of his last 10 games. He's gone under in 5 straight. But against the Celtics, he's covered in 3 out of his last 4, but only had 6 rebounds the last time he played them. Jalen Duren, his points prop is at 12.5. Matchup against the Celtics. It's not too bad, but it's not an easy one. He has covered in 6 out of his last 10 games. And against the Celtics, he scored 15 points against them last time, but did go under in 4 consecutive games prior to that. His rebound prop is at 11.5. He's got a tough matchup here. 3 out of his last 10 games, he's gone over it. And he's gone over in 3 out of his last 5 against the Celtics. So he has had some success against them in the past. And the last one is Jaden Ivey. So I took his assist prop today. It was a plus EV play. I got great odds for it, and it didn't cash anyway. So his points line, though, is at 15.5. He's gone under in 4 straight. He's covered in 4 of his last 10. The matchup against Boston, very difficult. But in head-to-head matchups, Jaden Ivey's had some success, going over in 4 out of his last 5 games. His assist prop is at 3.5 still. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. Only had 2 assists against the Miami Heat, unfortunately. Tough matchup, but he's covered in 4 out of his last 5 against the Boston Celtics. So, look, chances are is today's the day he covers his assist prop because he sucked today against Miami. Again, he's on a back-to-back. I'm not feeling it too much. I only played 24 minutes, though, so I don't know what's up with that. But, yeah, I'm not really feeling nothing for Jaden Ivey in this one. Pumping the brakes on this one real quick. I've got a few announcements and a little strategy to talk through. The first thing I wanted to say is thank you for everybody who watches, comments on these videos every single day. It honestly means a lot. You know, I get busy in that comment section replying to you all. The first thing I wanted to address, though, is I'm getting a lot of direct messages, comments, people reaching out to me saying, how can we thank you? How can we pay you? Wanted to let everybody know I do not have Cash App. That's not available in this country. So you can't Cash App me some money or anything like that. And I never ask you to. But if you did want to support the channel, the best way to do that is to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and if you can, watch until the end. The more that you watch these videos, the more YouTube is going to push this out to more people. Now, this channel is relatively small, especially in comparison to the other ones out there. So I am monetized from YouTube, but I'm not making a whole lot, to be honest. But the best way to support me financially, if you want to, is to use the links in the video description below. The outlier link, every time somebody signs up, I get a little bit of cut. I'm not going to lie to you. And same with BetUS. If you do happen to use them, take advantage of the promos, to be honest. Try to win as much as you can, obviously. But if you do use them, there's a chance for me to get a small portion of that as well. So that's how you can support me. Watching the video all the way through to the end, like, sub, and then using those links in the video description. But the other one, let's talk a little bit of strategy. So in my last video, I put up 10 different bets. I did line shop a lot of those bets, and I found a few of those bets were really positively geared in terms of EV. So when I did my line shopping, there was a particular sportsbook that really stood out and gave me much better odds in comparison to the rest. So positive EV plays. I also had some success taking my 10 picks, reducing them all down a little bit. So buying it back at a lower price, putting them into a massive parlay, and every single one of those hit. So basically what you're going to see, the difference in the strategies, I'm still going to have single bets, but what I want to do is I'll only share the single bets I choose to take, which are P plus EV, meaning I found much better odds compared to the other sportsbook that I use. Whereas if all sportsbook have it at minus 110, I'm not going to take that bet because that line is probably exactly where it needs to be. But if I see all the sportsbook at like minus 30, then I find one sportsbook at minus 110, I'm taking that 110, and that's what I'm going to play as a single bet. So my single bets you find, they're all going to be plus EV plays. The other one I'm going to share is a parlay. It's pretty much all the bets that I did, all the single bets, and then I'm going to reduce them down into something safe. So I'm going to call this a BAP, all right? Put BAP in the comments, B-A-P, because what that is, it's a bitch-ass parlay. I'm going to...
Bitch-ass bitch.
Take those lines, and I'm going to reduce them down make them a little bit easier for us to hit, whether it be same game multis or some big ass parlay. That's a BAP, baby. It's a bitch ass parlay. So, right, BAP in the comment section if you understand what I'm saying and if you're going to start tailing. Now, let's get back into the video. Let's go. All right, so we're looking at the Portland Trailblazers versus the Chicago Bulls in this one. Alex Caruso, Kobe White, Matisse Thybulle, Jeremy Grant, all game time decisions in this one. So we'll get started with the Portland Trailblazers. And look, I've got DeAndre Ayton on my lean list right now because he's just on fire. I did lose my last bet on DeAndre Ayton, unfortunately. But points-wise, he's been doing a wonderful job. His line's at 19.5. He's covered this in 5 consecutive games now. 8 out of his last 10 games, he's covered this points line. The matchup against the Chicago Bulls, it's not a difficult one, and he's covered well in the past. He scored 22 points against them the last time they played. Looking at his rebound prop, 12.5. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10 games. Matchup, look, somewhat difficult, and the last time he played the Chicago Bulls, he finished with 12 boards, so he's very close to it. So DeAndre Ayton, I think there's some value there. Even, if I don't take him as a single, you'll see him in the BAP, in the bitch-ass parlay. He'll be in there. Anthony Simons, his points prop, 22.5. And now he does have a difficult matchup. The Bulls allow the fewest points to point guards on the season. Still, Anthony Simons been killing it, covering this line in 8 of his last 10 games. In head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 1 of his last 2 against the Chicago Bulls. If you want to look at his three-point market, because this man can put them up, he's covered his three-point line of 3.5 in 8 out of his last 10 games. The matchup with the Bulls is not as difficult from downtown as it is in just scoring in general. And in head-to-head matchups, 1 out of his last 2 games against them. And if you want to look at his assist prop, that line's at 6.5. It's plus money. The matchup's not too bad. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10 and 1 out of his last 2. So very much in one game, over in points, under in assists. The other game, under in points, over in assists. So, all right, who else have we got? So there's no one else from Portland I'd really consider, to be honest, because you're not going to see really accurate data. But we can jump into the Chicago Bulls and see what's getting busy. We'll start with DeMar DeRozan. His points prop, 22.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10 games. So a little bit up and down, somewhat inconsistent. In head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 1 of his last 2 against Portland. Turning to his assists, his line's at 5.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. He has covered in 2 consecutive games against the Portland Trailblazers, though. And then looking at his rebound line, it's at 4.5. 6 out of his last 10. And he's covered in 2 consecutive games against Portland. So based off those numbers, if you're looking at a 100% hit rate against Portland, you'll be looking at his rebounds plus assists. It's at 10.5. He had 14 and 13 in his last 2 games against them. And if you look at his last 10, he's covered in 6 out of his last 10 games. So I don't hate that for DeMar DeRozan, if I'm being honest with you. So I'm going to add it to my short list. And we'll see if I can get positive EV and the other stats that I check out, if they're ticking all the boxes, then it might be something that you find or could make its way to the BAP, right? Who else do we have in this? Nikola Vucevic. So he's up against DeAndre Ayton today. He's got a good matchup when it comes to scoring points. 21.5's the line. He's covered in 5 of his last 10, 2 out of his last 3 against the Blazers. Only scored 14 points the last time they matched up. His rebound line's at 11.5, 5 out of his last 10 games. The matchup's not too bad, but he's only covered in 1 out of his last 3 against them. He's capable of getting some assists. His line's at 2.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10, but he's covered in 3 consecutive games against the Blazers. The odds for that are at minus 160, so it's not something I would honestly entertain, but there might be someone out there who does. Ayo Dosunmu. Now, his points prop here is at 17.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games. Got 3 head-to-head matchups against Portland. He has gone under in all 3, but keep in mind, he's playing a lot more minutes than this at the moment, playing close to 40 minutes a night. So looking at his assist numbers, 5.5's the line. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10, and head-to-head matchups under in all 3. And his three-point market, which has been popular in the past. He made 4 against Washington. Line's at 2.5. It's plus money. 3 out of his last 10. And he's hit this in 2 out of his last 3 against Portland. So someone like Ayo Dosunmu, that's going to require a little bit more research, but you'd also want to wait till Kobe White's confirmed. So if no Kobe White, much bigger usage rate for Ayo Dosunmu as well. If Caruso's out, Dosunmu could find himself playing 40 minutes in this game. I think he's got a good chance to get a lot of points, rebounds, and assists if those guys are out, but you'd have to wait till closer to tip-off to figure that one. And other than that, let's jump into the next game. It's the Minnesota Timberwolves versus the Utah Jazz. Now, much like some of the other games, limited markets available. Kyle Anderson, Rudy Gobert, Laurie Markkinen, all game time decisions in this one. So we don't have too many lines available. But Laurie Markkinen's numbers there. So let's check out Laurie. So his points prop, 23 and a half. He has covered this in 3 out of his last 10. The matchup somewhat difficult. And in head-to-head matchups against Minnesota, he's been close, but he's only covered in 1 out of his last 3. His rebound prop, 7.5, 4 out of his last 10 games, and he's covered in 2 out of his last 3 against the Timberwolves. He did play, how long's it been? It's been 15 days since his last game, so I'd be pretty hesitant to bet on Laurie Markkinen full stop, even if he was to play. And if I did bet it, I'd probably take the under, not gonna lie. So probably an under in his PRA, to be honest. Just looking him to have some sort of rust. But yeah, even that, he's covered in 5 out of his last 10. Timberwolves are a difficult matchup. So yeah, definitely lean to the under, but yeah, it doesn't sound like a fun bet to make. All right, let's jump into these Timberwolves. We'll start with Anthony Edwards. So Anthony Edwards against Utah, matchup somewhat difficult. His line's at 31.5. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 10 games. In head-to-head matches against Utah, he's actually gone under in 6 consecutive games. His last 3 games, he scored 31 points against them in all 3 games. Looking at his assist prop, line's at 4.5. 4 out of his last 10 games. Matchup somewhat difficult, but he has covered this in 4 consecutive games against the Jazz. His 3-point line's at 2.5. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 10. And in head-to-head matches, he's covered in 4 out of his last 6. Rebound-wise, that line's at 6.5. Has covered in 3 consecutive games, but prior to that, 7 games in a row he's gone under. And in head-to-head matchups, he's covered in his last 3 games against the Utah Jazz. So based on what I'm seeing there, I'm probably thinking rebounds plus assists maybe could be a good play for Anthony Edwards. You're looking at 11.5. He has covered in 3 consecutive games against Utah. Strong numbers in both rebounding and assists. And looking at his last 10, he has covered that in 3 consecutive games as well. So most likely, if we play around with the filters, we know Karl Anthony Towns isn't going to be there. We can see with no Karl Anthony Towns, he's covered this in 6 out of his last 10 games. He's played against Utah without Cat, and his last 2 games without Cat, he had 15 rebounds plus assists. And the odds are pretty good here, minus 104. So I'm going to add that to my short list, and I'll investigate that a little bit more later on. All right, and next up, we'll look at Rudy Gobert. Hopefully he plays. I think he's still got that left rib sprain. But let's see. So he hasn't played in 5 games. He was a game time decision in the most recent game, which he missed. But let's check him out anyway. So up against his old team, does have a good matchup. The line's at 14.5. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10. In head-to-head matches, he's covered in 2 out of his last 5 against them. Rebound-wise, that line's at 13.5. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games. He's gone under in 4 consecutive games against the Utah Jazz. And the Jazz are a pretty good rebounding team, so probably won't be as easy for Rudy. So honestly, I'd lean to the under in his points plus rebounds, knowing that he's injured, knowing that he struggled against Utah in his last 2 games, and he's gone under in his last 2. But yeah, not overly arousing, I must say. Now looking at the Memphis Grizzlies versus Sacramento Kings. So Desmond Bane looks like he's going to be available, which is pretty exciting. Haven't had a chance to look at Desmond Bane for quite some time. But what do we have? We've got Vince Williams as a game time decision in this. Obviously, there's a lot of outs for Memphis still, but Desmond Bane is going to be lacing them up. So let's kick it off with Desmond Bane. Playing point guard apparently in this one. We'll look at both guard profiles anyway. Now, Desmond Bane made his return against OKC, scored 22 points, which is pretty good. He played 31 minutes, attempted only 17 shots. I don't remember his game log, so I'd be interested to see how he stacks up. But yeah, he's covered this in 7 out of his last 10, but that last game was his first game in 2 months, right? So how much of this previous information could you really factor in? I think what we should just be considering here, it's Desmond Bane and everyone else is pretty much out. Jared Jackson Jr. is going to be there, but
I think Desmond Bain assist could be a good option. I'm not too sure, but he did score 22 points in his return. He made 4 3-pointers, which is pretty good. He shot 4 from 9 from downtown. Looking at his assists, the line's at 5.5. He had 7 assists in his return. And looking at his rebound numbers, line's at 4.5. So we're seeing assist numbers of 5.5, which is a lot higher than they would normally be. But we've only got one game sample since he's returned. In terms of the matchup, yeah, the Kings do allow quite a few assists, so I don't hate that. But that -5 over 5.5 is -145. So yeah, the odds aren't great. So for someone like Desmond Bain, I think best to just sit and wait, give him a week or two to figure it himself out, and then we can take our bets from there. Unless you got other information that I haven't considered, go for your life. Jaren Jackson Jr., tough matchup here against the Kings. His line's at 22.5. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 10 games. In head-to-head matchups against Sacramento, he's gone under in 5 consecutive games. So I would personally be looking at the under here for Jaren Jackson Jr. So I'm going to add that to my short list. Looking at his last 10 games, what did he do? He scored 19 points against OKC in that last game. It wasn't a blowout, so he played 36 minutes. Only attempted 11 shots. So got to the free throw line a lot then? No. Made 3 3-pointers. Right. So with Desmond Bain in the lineup, does that help Jaren Jackson score? Probably not. So I don't know that the matchup is a difficult one against Domantas Sabonis. So I'd probably lean to the under on that one. Let's jump into the Sacramento Kings. We've got De'Aaron Fox up first. So his line's at 25.5. He does have a good matchup here against Memphis. He's covered this in 2 of his last 6. He's gone under in 4 consecutive games against them. His assist line is at 6.5. It's plus money. He's covered that in 3 straight, 6 out of his last 10. Does have a good matchup here, but he's only gone over in 1 out of his last 6 against Memphis. Rebound-wise, 4 out of his last 6 against Memphis he's covered, and 7 out of his last 10. So he does have a good matchup here. The Grizzlies allow the most rebounds to point guards on the season. But if Desmond Bain is playing point guard in this game, that might be a little bit different because all the other point guards they've been playing, you can sag off them all day and get some rebounds. Desmond Bain is not going to be left open. So even that for De'Aaron Fox, I'd be a little bit hesitant to take. I'm going to look at Domantas Sabonis. Now, I do like him to have a big game, points and rebounds in this one, but I still need to do a bit more research. But his points props at 19.5. He's got a pretty decent matchup. It's not too difficult against the Grizzlies. Line's at 19.5. Plus money, 5 out of his last 10, but 4 out of his last 5. And in head-to-head matchups, did score 20 points most recently against them. Prior to that, has struggled. Looking at his prop, that's at 8.5. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 10. Difficult matchup, but he's covered in 3 out of his last 6. And then rebound-wise, his line's at 13.5. Of course it is. He's got a good matchup here against Memphis. 8 out of his last 10 games, and he's covered in 3 out of his last 6. Now, this is rebounds. His last 2 games against Memphis, he's got 20-plus rebounds in those 2 games. Absolutely crazy. All right, we're going to have a look at the points props for Keegan Murray, Harrison Barnes, and even Kevin Huerter just to see what's happening. Keegan Murray up first. Points props at 14.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. Has only covered in 2 out of his last 6 against Memphis. Kevin Huerter, his points props at 8.5. He's only covered in 4 out of his last 10. Difficult matchup, but he's covered in 4 out of his last 6. I actually wanted to look at his assist prop, right, just to show you guys. The odds aren't great. Check that out, -163. But Kevin Huerter has covered in 10 consecutive games now. Looking at his last 20, he's covered in 16 of his last 20. And in head-to-head matches, he's covered in 4 out of his last 6 against them. So Kevin Huerter to get some assists. His minutes aren't great, so it might be a little bit of a sweat. But he has been hitting that in every single game in his last 10. Harrison Barnes, lines at 12.5. He's covered this in 3 straight, 5 out of his last 10, and against the Grizzlies, 4 out of his last 6. He did, however, go under in his last 2 games. Jump into the next game. It's a New York Knicks versus the Golden State Warriors. And in this one, OG Anunoby is a game-time decision. The Golden State Warriors, surprisingly healthy. Nobody on the injury list for them, so let's get into this game. We'll start with the New York Knicks. We'll start with OG Anunoby, actually. So his points prop is at 11.5. He's covered this in 8 of his last 10 games, Only had 2 points against the Sacramento Kings in 33 minutes, and he shot 1 from 8. To verse the Golden State Warriors since he's joined the Knicks, but 11.5, he's quite a low line. Wonder what type of injury he's got. Right elbow, so that's not good given that he's right-handed and he needs that to shoot. So if he's suffering from a right elbow injury, makes sense that his line's a little bit lower. So I wouldn't say bet the under. I'd personally just avoid him for now. The next player is Josh Hart. We'll check all of his props because this man can do it all. Points-wise, 7 out of his last 10 games. He has gone under in his last 2. In head-to-head matchups, he scored 14 points last time against the Warriors. He does have a good matchup. Looking at those last 2 games, he's still playing minutes. He's just taken less shots. Now, what happened in those last 2 games? OG Anunoby returned. So if OG is out, I think this guy's points prop is probably a great way to go. If he is ruled out, I think this line moves as well. So if you got the balls for it, you can take it early, potentially cash it out once lineups are confirmed, or just ride it. So that's what I'm thinking about Josh Hart. Let's have a look at his assists. Line's at 4.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10, only 1 out of his last 5. Difficult matchup, but he had 7 assists the last time he played the Warriors. And his rebound prop is now at 10.5. He's a rebounding beast. The matchup's not too bad. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10, 4 games in a row. And he had 18 rebounds the last time he played the Warriors. And the Knicks still lost by 11. So obviously Josh Hart rebounds on my radar. Points plus rebounds on my radar. So something I need to suss out, search some odds, and see what we find. All right, we're taking a look at Dante DiVincenzo now. His points line in this game is 15.5. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10 games, but only 1 out of his last 5. The matchup's not too bad against the Golden State Warriors. In head-to-head matchups, he scored 16 points the last time they played, so that line feels like it's just about right. I'm not willing to take it. 3-point line's at 3.5. He's only covered in 5 out of his last 10. The matchup's not great, and he only had 2 3-pointers the last time he versed the Warriors. Looking at his assists, that line's at 2.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. Tough matchup, and he only had 2 assists the last time he played them. And then his rebound line's at 4.5. 4 out of his last 10, had 7 boards the last time against the Warriors. So nothing but Dante that's getting me excited. Let's have a look at Jalen Brunson. So Jalen Brunson, back-to-back 40-point games. Check that out against Portland and Sacramento. He's got a good matchup here against the Warriors. His line's at 29.5. 4 out of his last 10 games. Last 3 games against the Warriors, he has gone under in all 3. But keep in mind, the Julius Randle impact probably impacted those first 2. So got pretty close to it the last time he played the Warriors. Looking at his assist numbers, that line's at 6.5. 5 out of his last 10. Definitely got under in his last 2, obviously. If he's scoring 40-plus points, less assists needed to be had. And his rebound prop, 3.5. He's covered this in 3 out of his last 10 and 2 out of his last 3 against the Warriors. Sorry, his assist numbers against the Warriors haven't been great. He's gone under in 3 consecutive games. So, yeah, I'm not feeling Jalen Brunson in this one, but if he scores 40 again, so be it. Jonathan Kuminga, his recent form is excellent. So his points prop, 17.5. He's covered this in 9 out of his last 10 games. The matchup is not a difficult one, and it's even easier if OG Anunoby is not available to play. So he's covered in 9 out of his last 10, scored 25 points the last time they played, and went under in the 2 games prior, which were last season. So this is on my short list to look at. I really do like that line so far, but I'll dive in a bit further. Looking at his rebound prop, the line's at 5.5. 4 out of his last 10. He's gone under in 4 straight. He's got a difficult matchup. Did have 8 rebounds against them last time, though, covering in 1 out of his last 3. So Kuminga points definitely has my attention. I do like what I'm seeing on Andrew Wiggins props. Check this out. Line's at 10.5. Matchup is good. He's covered in 8 out of his last 10 games, and he scored 20 points the last time he played the Knicks. But keeping that in mind, that was last season. Looking at his rebound prop, that's at 4.5. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 10, so that's not crazy. Did have 7 rebounds the last time he played them, but the matchup is a good one, so I wouldn't write him off too early. I'd investigate that a little bit further. Draymond Green, what do we see? Difficult matchup for points. Line's only at 6.5, 5 out of his last 10. He's covered in 3 consecutive games against the Knicks. His assist numbers also at 5.5, 5 out of his last 10, and 3 consecutive games against the Knicks. And his rebound numbers, 7.5, 5 out of his last 10 as well, And in head-to-head matchups, 2 out of his last 3. So this 5 out of 10 business pissing me off. Let's check his PRA. That's 6 out of his last 10. Right. So I would be betting on Draymond. The numbers are quite low, but he's probably just doing a lot of cardio out there, setting a lot of screens. So Brandon Pods, let's check him out. So his points line's at 9.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. Only scored 2 points against the Knicks last time. His assist numbers, 4.5, 3 out of his last 10, and only had 4 assists last time. And his rebound numbers, 5.5, 5 out of his last 10 games, and he only had 3 rebounds the last time against the Knicks. And the man we've been waiting for, the chef, Steph Curry. Points prop, 26.5. 4 out of his last 10 games he's gone over. Does have a difficult matchup here against the Warriors, and he scored 31 points against them last time, 24 points prior to that. His 3-point line's at 4.5, minus 150. He's covered that in 4 out of his last 10 games, and he's killed them in his last 2 with 5 and 8 3-pointers. So the matchup is difficult, but Steph Curry don't give a shit. His assist line's at 4.5, 6 out of his last 10 games, and 1 out of his last 2 against the Knicks. Looking at his rebounds, that's at 3.5, 5 out of his last 10, and he covered in both games against the New York Knicks. So, yeah, Steph Curry, I'm not too sure. I'm not feeling it, not gonna lie. Jumping into the last game, it's the Atlanta Hawks versus the Los Angeles Lakers. And you guessed it, LeBron James, Anthony Davis, both game time decisions in this game. So let's get in there. Take a look at the Atlanta Hawks first, and we'll finish with the boys from LA. We'll start with Jalen Johnson. His points prop here is at 17.5. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10 games. The matchup against the Lakers is not a bad one. In head-to-head matchups, he had 19 points the last time they played, went under in the previous 2. There's no other prop lines available for Jalen Johnson at the minute, so we just get to see his points prop. So I have to check in a little bit later to see more of that. Having a look at who else do we have? Let's check DeAndre Hunter. So similar to Jalen Johnson, just a points prop available, and I think it's only on a limited number of sports books, but line's at 15.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. The matchup's not difficult, but it's not easy either. He's covered in 1 of 2 against the Lakers. Looking into Clint Capella now, I did like what I had, liked what I saw for Clint Capella when I had a quick look earlier on. His points props at 11.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10, 4 out of his last 5. So he's been playing quite well lately. Head-to-head matchups, scored 13 points against the Lakers the last time they played. His rebound prop looks even better, I believe. 9.5. He's smashed that in 5 consecutive games. Has a good matchup against the Lakers here. And he had 12 rebounds the last time he played them. So not hating that for Clint Capella to go over his rebound line. Not gonna lie. Bogdan Bogdanovic, points prop here is at 15.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10, 2 out of his last 3 against the Lakers. 3-point markets at 2.5. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games. And against the Lakers, he's covered in 2 out of his last 3. If you're interested in looking at his assists, the line's at 4.5. He's gone under in 3 straight against the Lakers. And he's hit in 3 out of his last 10 games. DeJounte Murray. Got a good matchup here against the Lakers. His line's at 25.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. He's gone under in 3 consecutive games against LA. His assist line's at 8.5. The matchup's not bad, but it's not a great one. 6 out of his last 10, 2 out of his last 3 against the Lakers. And then his rebound line, 4.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10, and only 1 out of his last 3 against the Lakers. So I'm not really feeling DeJounte too much in this one. Anthony Glass Davis. Now, let's see what he's got today. Left eye abrasion, so that's no good. LeBron's got left ankle tendonitis. He's probably going to have that for the rest of his career. But let's check out AD. So his points prop is at 24.5. The matchup, it's not a difficult one, but it's not easy against Atlanta. But he's covered this in only 2 of his last 10 games, and he's yet to verse the Hawks. His rebound line, that's at 13.5. Good matchup against Atlanta, but he's only covered this in 3 out of his last 10 games. And his assist props at 3.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. So nothing on AD that I like. Let's check out Austin Reeves. Only his points prop is available. Actually, I lied. His other props are available too. Points-wise, 6 out of his last 10 games. The matchup's not too bad. He's scored 28 points the last time he played Atlanta. Lakers still lost by 16, but he's covered in 1 out of his last 2. Assist-wise, 4.5, covered in 4 of his last 10 games, 1 out of his last 2 against the Hawks. And then jumping into his rebounds, the line there is 4.5, and he's covered that. Well, he hasn't covered that against the Hawks, going under in 2 straight. So, yeah, I'm not loving what I'm seeing from Austin Reeves. Maybe his 3-point prop, that's plus money, 2.5. He's covered that in 5 out of his last 7 games, out of 2 against the Atlanta Hawks. So, add 2, that'll probably be my play. Let's check out Rui's points prop. So Rui's 13.5. He's covered in 3 consecutive games now, 6 out of his last 10. Scored 16 points the last time he played the Atlanta Hawks. And we've got D'Lo, his points prop, 17.5. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10. Great matchup here against the Hawks. In head-to-head matches, he only scored 9 points the last time these teams played. Looking at his assists, the line's at 5.5. He's been smashing this as of late, 4 consecutive games over it, 6 out of his last 10. He's got a great matchup. Only had 5 assists last time against Atlanta, and he only played 27 minutes. These days, he's seeing at least 36 minutes of action on the season. So I can't help but lean to the over here for D'Lo. Points plus assists. He's covered that in 6 of his last 10, and he does have a great matchup for both of these points and assists. So I don't hate that. I just hope it doesn't do one of these quiet things. But yeah, I'll look into it. I'll see if there's a positive EV play around D'Lo, and if there isn't, we won't make a play on it. Simple as that. And the last player to look through is the King, LeBron James. So his points props, 25.5. He's covered in 8 of his last 10. Just scored 40 points against the Golden State Warriors. In head-to-head matchups, he's gone under in his last 2 against Atlanta. Prior to that, he scored 47. His assist props are 8.5, and I do like this one. It's plus money. He's got an out of 10 hit rate, and in head-to-head matches, he's covered in 2 out of his last 3, and the matchup is a good one. His rebound prop can be a little bit difficult to play. He is a little bit inconsistent on the rebounds these days, but if AD is not good to go, LeBron should gobble these rebounds up. Line's at 7.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games, and in head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 2 out of his last 3. I got the odds for this on 7.5 at minus 130. That tells me that AD is unlikely to play. LeBron's rebound line has been sitting at around 6.5, sometimes 5.5 as of late, but it could also be this recent lift in his rebounding performance, which is driving that upwards. So, but yeah, keeping that in mind, I think his assist prop is great. His points prop, I'd be a little bit hesitant after he just scored 40 points. Looking at his last 20, his biggest game he's had was 36, and then he came back, and that was against Golden State as well. 36, and then he came back with 23 points 2 days later. So he's just for Golden State Warriors. He's on a back-to-back as well. Yeah, I wouldn't feel too confident about his points prop given these trends, but look, he's LeBron James after all. I wouldn't be overly surprised if we see him smash it. So just to recap on a few things, he did skip through the interlude. Slightly different strategy when it comes to choosing my final bets. I obviously have a short list. I then review them all based off my strategies. Then I eliminate the ones I don't feel are worth playing. And then I'm left with about 5 to 10 different props. Instead of playing every single prop, what I'm then going to do is line shop all those props. And then I'm only going to bet the positive EV plays that I find. I'll bet those as single bets. All the other ones that I do like by the end of my analysis, I'm going to pretty much put them into a bitch-ass parlay, whereas I take someone's line and I reduce it a little bit further just for a bit of safety, because the amount of times I fall 1 or 2 points short is unbelievable. It means the books are very good and I cannot beat them. But hopefully we can beat them with some bitch-ass parlays. So let me know in the comment section if you're riding with me. Type in BAP or bitch-ass parlay or whatever gets you going. If you do want to see more of my content, or if you want to see the strategy that I use behind the scenes, feel free to watch this video right here, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace!
Sub to the channel cause your boy's getting busy. Coming to you live from the west side of Sydney. We've got the free picks and the juice and the daily. It's all free, you don't even have to pay me.